Many years ago, I had a dream about opening a club which would only open its doors between the months of October and April. A warm, welcoming place with roaring log fires and cozy nooks where you could sit with your friends and chat about things that interest you. Well, I couldn't even begin to afford to open a club, so the dream died. But its passing is commemorated by this podcast, presenting for the winter months a series of cozy chats with friends old and new on topics of interest. Welcome to the October Club. My guest tonight is Adam Manning, a solicitor, notary, and former mayor of Eastleigh in Hampshire, England. He'll be joining me to discuss the specific topic of Star Trek lore, taking in along the way interplanetary travel, geopolitics, and astrophysics. Hello, Adam. Thank you for joining me on the October Club.
I'm delighted to be here, Paul.
Yes, we're going to be talking about Star Trek lore. I think I'd originally asked you if you wanted to just talk about Star Trek, but because of your background, you thought it'd be more interesting to talk about Star Trek lore.
Well, I thought this might be more of a particular topic for us to talk about. I am a Star Trek fan, although I have to say I've not actually watched every episode of all the different types of Star Trek there are out there.
Yeah.
But I've always been fascinated by the history of the Star Trek universe. How does it end up being in that particular culture? And I've really become interested in space law through my membership of what's called the British Interplanetary Society, which is a space advocacy organization, because I'm generally interested in space and the exploration of space. And I became an active member of a group that was involved with that. And as a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, as you know, in my daytime job, a solicitor and a notary. I thought it might be useful to examine space law and see how that affects the exploration of space.
Yeah.
And then through that, as a Star Trek fan, you then start thinking a bit laterally, and you realize that one thing that's quite peculiar about Star Trek, and this might be simply because it's a symptom of how much Star Trek there is, how many episodes there are. They've got to come up with stories about something.
Yeah.
I've always been slightly surprised how much the law and legal principles play a role in the Star Trek world. And the key thing there is the Prime Directive. Although they regularly have courtroom battles about all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this. I was thinking how Star Trek, probably more so than any other science fiction series, there's a lot of sort of legal consequences of things that happen.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it, for example, to Doctor Who, I know we're both fans of Doctor Who, but if you look at something like the Trial of a Time Lord, he's on trial for his life, and at the end of it, he saves the universe, and the people that are prosecuting him just kind of go, "Oh, that's all right," all charges are dropped, and you think it's not very, it's nice fantasy, but it's not very credible. Whereas with Star Trek, you have situations like the end of Star Trek 4 where they've essentially saved the world, but they still have to face up to the consequences of their actions in the previous film.
Yes. Yeah. The blackguards. Yes, absolutely. I wonder. I do think in some ways it's because there is so much Star Trek. The writers are constantly having to think, what on earth are we going to write about next week? But it is quite a fascinating aspect of Star Trek. I know that there is interestingly a bit of academic study of the law and how legal mechanisms are presented in Star Trek.
Yeah.
My own interest comes from studying the aspects of space law that relate to human settlement of space and the ownership or non-ownership, as the case may be, of outer space, of the moon, of other planets.
Yeah.
Or even, for example, other star systems, and the ownership of the resources that are found there. That's the specific point that I've been studying as part of my space law project with the British Interplanetary Society. And because of that, I began to see parallels as a Star Trek fan
Yeah,
with those principles and the major legal principle that is presented in Star Trek of the Prime Directive.
yeah,
And in many ways, the Prime Directive is a bit of a plot device, because you're giving these people who otherwise seem fairly free and easy in the way that they're exploring the universe, you're
yeah,
giving them a very serious constraint
yeah.
on how they go about that. And then that gives you moral dilemmas and tension that the
Hmm.
characters then undergo in making an exciting story. So that's the specific point that I've been studying.
Yeah, I mean, because it is sort of, in a way, it's almost unique in having this kind of central thing about it, that it's not entirely pushing it as a good thing all the time. It's kind of going, well, this is, this is the center of this universe, but sometimes it's not as good as it is other times.
I wholly agree. Every time the Prime Directive seems to be presented, it seems to just be a pain in the butt.
Yeah,
Basically, it's as if the characters would love to carry on and behave in a certain particular way, but
yeah,
darn it, the Prime Directive is just stopping us from doing that. Nobody
yeah,
ever. I can't really think of many examples where people say, "Great, the Prime Directive is going to help us here."
yes,
We're going to have a great day. We're going to have a wonderful exploration. We're going to have a brilliant mission because the Prime Directive really helps us to make this
yeah,
all happen. It's always. I mean, this takes us on. You're then thinking about the nature of law, the nature of rules,
yeah,
I think the Prime Directive is often presented as a moral law. Do you
yeah,
know what I mean? It's
yeah,
presented. This is a law that's all about good behaviour.
yeah,
I mean, all laws to some extent have a moral content to them, but it's not like it's a business law. It's not like it's a law of property or anything like that. It's a
yeah,
serious philosophical. And as Captain Picard famously says, it's a law, it's a rule, and a very philosophical one as well.
yeah,
So it's presented very much in that light, but nobody. It's not like anybody has anybody's smiling or whatever or happy when they talk
yeah.
about it. It's a major downer, really. So it's fascinating stuff. It really is.
Yeah. It's odd because it's kind of a mixture in a way that, as you say, in one sense it is sort of philosophical, but in another, it's quite often the consequences are presented as quite military. I mean, there are court martials, which they go out their way to say Starfleet isn't a military organization, and yet it has all these military trappings. So it's almost as if it's been a military organization and it's kind of really trying to tear away from that, but it still has some of the military things about it.
I think that's right. I hadn't really thought about that before, but I think that must be right. So Starfleet and the
Yeah.
whole approach of Starfleet is, and there are often in Star Trek, there's often a tension between the military aspects of Starfleet
Yeah.
and pure exploration and scientific discovery. And
Hmm.
there's often the feeling, and sometimes it's more explicit than other times, that they'd rather not have the military at all and it
Yeah.
be purely exploration and purely scientific discovery, and we don't need a military. But then at the same time, you quite rightly say, you then have these hearings, and they have a little bell that they ring,
Yeah.
and then the person running it is often in some sort of special robe, and everybody's sat around tables, and it looks very serious.
Yeah.
And there's those. I mean, if we're talking about court martials, I'm thinking in particular of the episodes with Wesley when he's
Yeah.
in serious trouble
Mhm.
for this particular maneuver. I think it is that kills one of his student colleagues.
Yes.
And there it's very serious. It's very militarized.
Mhm.
Uh, so I do wonder whether that's just a way of just embellishing the drama somewhat for the
Yeah.
audience. I think with Star Trek, it's often to overthink these things and think, and what you have to sit back and think is these are producers making a show for a mainstream audience. How do you
Yeah.
make it appealing and
Yeah.
exciting
I mean,
for a
there is that element that isn't there that kind of when Star Trek: The Next Generation came in, Gene Roddenberry was very, oh, it's totally unmilitary. I don't want to have any conflict. I don't want any guns. I don't want any of that stuff. And it gradually eases off as it goes on, as they're realizing there's not a lot of kind of drama in some of
No,
these situations. We need to kind of bring a bit of that back in. It is, after
yeah,
all, a drama series, you know.
yeah. You're absolutely right. I often think that for a show that is purportedly about scientific discovery and exploration, a
Yeah.
lot of the plots really are wars.
Yes.
I mean, you look at First Contact, for example, the Star Trek First Contact, which is a brilliant film,
Hmm.
and one of the best films. And that's a military conflict. You know, that's
Yeah.
all about a big battle.
Yeah.
Wrath of Khan, again, one of the best Star Trek films there is. It's really a big battle.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
if I recall correctly, there's a point in one of the films, I think, when Captain Picard turns to Riker and says, do you ever remember the days when we used to be explorers?
Yes.
You know, as they rush into another
Yeah.
great battle. But
Yeah.
I think the reason is you're absolutely right. Conflict, major conflict, is very exciting for an audience to watch. You know, a struggle of the
Yeah.
protagonists for survival
Yeah.
is one of the most intense things for an audience to watch.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, you've got, I mean, personally, I really like it, but Star Trek, the motion picture, a lot of people can't stand. And that's really the epitome of Gene Roddenberry's thing of no conflict, isn't it? That
Yeah,
is really
yeah,
about exploration,
yeah.
but it is quite slow. I like it, but it's slow. And you
It,
think you
yeah.
couldn't watch a lot of that.
No, 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 no. And going back to this sort of difference between exploration, the exploration theme on the one hand, and the military
Yeah.
theme, I think you're absolutely right. The motion picture is the best emblemation of what that might be like if it was all about exploration.
Yeah.
And if you read the novel, for example,
Mhm.
the novelization suggests that the culture of the Federation is very much that aspect of scientific discovery, of getting away from being militarized,
Yeah.
and so forth. And I love the motion picture, but I watched it the other day because my daughter is watching all these films for the first time,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we watched the motion picture, and I loved it, but I really felt like falling off into a deep slumber. Two
There's
thirds
a
of the way.
story I often tell about. Once years ago. It was Christmas Eve, and I was finishing half day from work, and I came home from work, and I thought, oh, Star Trek the motion picture's on. So I
Yeah,
switched it on, and it was the bit where Kirk is in the shuttle with Scotty, and they're going round the Enterprise, and they just
yeah.
started going round the Enterprise, and I thought, I'll go and make a cup of tea and a sandwich or something. So I went in the kitchen, made a cup of tea, made a sandwich, came back, and they're still going round the bloody Enterprise. It's just, that sequence must be
Oh,
about 12 minutes long. It's just,
oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. It's just so, it is so ridiculously overindulgent though.
yeah,
I think they just let Gene Roddenberry spend millions and millions of pounds on his own vision
yeah,
and nobody sat back and thought, is Joe Popcorn sat in the
yeah,
back row of the cinema really gonna be thrilled by all this?
yeah,
Uh, and what's strange is that I mean, it's a fantastic opening, you know, with the Klingons,
yeah, yeah,
and the initial depiction of Earth, you know, with the Starfleet base on San Francisco. I
yeah,
love all that sort of stuff. Um, it's just but it's just they get into 2001 Space Odyssey sort of territory, and then
yeah,
it just loses it really. Uh,
yeah,
you know, I think Star Wars changed so much about what we think of films, and I think it's
yeah,
the Star Wars effect where if you're not absolutely thrilled to bits every 3 minutes or so, then there's something wrong. You know,
yeah. I
it,
think if they'd made motion picture in like before Star Wars, in like sort of 75 or 76,
yeah,
it would be a lot more highly regarded because there were a lot of very serious science fiction films in the early 70s.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely,
things like Soylent
absolutely.
Green and
Silent Running,
Westworld, yeah, Silent Running, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you're right. If it had come out at that time, the effects would have been amazing. But then I suppose the thing is, and I'm not convinced that it would have actually got made.
Yeah,
Because they wouldn't have been thinking of such a huge budget, for
yeah,
example.
yeah.
But then, of course, we're off into thinking about the lost series of Star Trek. Star Trek,
Oh,
what is it?
Phase two, yeah.
Yes, exactly, in the mid 70s, and the Vulcan officer Zon, who
Yeah.
they wanted to bring in. And of course, Ilea, the Delton character, Ilea,
Yeah.
comes from, she was a character in Phase 2.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and they just kind of kicked it up into being a motion picture after Star Wars came out.
Yeah.
But I regret that they didn't make that series, because I think that would have been a fascinating look at the Star Trek philosophy in the mid
In the
70s,
70s. Yeah. Yeah.
with all that would have meant, and you see the designs that have been put forward for that series. I think that would have been, at this point, that would have been far more fascinating for us as fans in
Yeah.
some ways than the motion picture. Love it as I do. Uh,
Yeah. It would have been interesting because the original series really was kind of sort of during the Vietnam War.
yeah,
Um, Whereas that would have been post-Vietnam. It would have been just post-Vietnam, but it would have been post-Vietnam. So it would have been interesting to see how that changed the American viewpoint on those things.
I would have loved to have seen it, and I think the uniforms would have been
Yeah.
wonderfully mid 70s.
Yeah.
But there we are. There we are. Star Wars came out, and they thought, right, this is a way to make lots of money. Let's make a motion picture, and they did.
Yeah. It's interesting in the original series in the 60s that on one hand it is about it does embrace the whole counterculture thing, and Star Trek and Spock in particular were very popular with the kind of counterculture side of things. But on the other side, it's quite join Starfleet, wear a uniform, get a nice haircut. So it's from the beginning, it's very contradictory. And I think the Prime Directive is also part of that sort of contradiction, isn't it?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think the origins of the Prime Directive culturally are
Yeah,
very much along the lines that you're talking about. Um, it comes from concerns, to my mind, about things such as the Vietnam War, the
yeah,
rise of environmentalism during the 60s.
yeah,
And in many ways, the rise of environmentalism was inspired to some degree by space exploration. So
yeah,
during the 60s, they were receiving photos of the whole of the Earth for the
yeah,
first time, showing the Earth as one single body. And that had a tremendous inspiring effect on the environmental movement.
yeah,
So you've got those. And I think also, more generally, the Prime Directive perhaps can be seen as symptomatic of American concerns about isolationism and
yeah,
not always getting wrapped up in the world's problems.
yeah,
So I think there are resources, there are sources for the Prime Directive, and I think you're absolutely right. Ultimately, it does come from the counterculture movement of
yeah,
more of moving away from a militaristic depiction of a society, and I
yeah,
think in the very first season of Star Trek, it is very much more. It is in some ways quite a militaristic depiction
yeah,
of Starfleet, but with plots dealing with such things as the Prime Directive, you're moving away from that whole structure
yeah,
into a show that is trying to portray much more of the philosophy of the times, of what was
yeah,
going on in popular culture and society generally.
yeah. I think science fiction in general in America around that time is very influenced by Vietnam. I mean, I can't think of any science fiction which seems to be positively influenced by it. It all seems to be, oh, we've made a terrible mistake here in sort of interfering in this war that we really had no place in.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think the Vietnam experience is very important in American society, and that feeds through into the culture that we see in shows such as Star Trek.
Yeah,
I mean, for example, you've got that extraordinary episode, Pattern of Force,
yeah,
where Kirk and Spock and the crew of the Enterprise, to their shock, discover a whole planet run by what appears to be Nazi Germany, by the
yeah,
Nazis. Um, and that ultimately transpires that is because somebody interfered wrongly with a culture and set it on a
yeah.
disastrous path. So that's a very striking depiction of that sort of idea.
Yeah, there's kind of a sense that the past of space exploration before Starfleet was a bit of a free for all, and people with various philosophies, not all of them great, were going out there and colonizing planets.
I think that's right. I was reflecting on this before we started talking, but there does seem to be a sort of implicit history that prior to the Prime Directive, Starfleet was really mucking things up very badly.
Yeah,
Uh, and Pattern of Force is one of those sorts of programs where that's come out. There's other things like the Omega Glory where that seems to be a problem as well.
yeah,
So I think you're absolutely right that that there is this kind of before and after effect. And I think in Enterprise, I've not watched a lot of Enterprise, I have to say, but in Enterprise, some of the stories bring that out. And Captain
yeah,
Archer is very much one of the characters who grapples with this particular
yeah,
problem
yeah,
because there is no prime directive at that point,
yeah,
and he becomes aware of the enormous responsibility that he is facing
yeah.
as a result.
I mean, I suppose it's got a his historical precedent, hasn't it? Because you've got stories from history of colonists going to places and wiping out entire civilizations by taking the common cold with them and things. So it's, I suppose they were looking back at that. They were looking back at mistakes that we had actually made in our own history.
Yep, I think that's exactly right. So, from my point of view, I think one of the best depictions of that sort of thing that you're talking about in the real world
Yeah.
is what's called the Antarctic Treaty. So,
All
there's
right.
in the 50s, countries started claiming sections of Antarctica for themselves, and this started to become a real issue. And there were serious concerns that military bases were going to be placed in Antarctica, that
Yeah.
countries would start trying to develop sections of Antarctica that they claimed. And one of the success stories of the new United Nations at the time was coming up with a system that is now referred to as the Antarctica Treaty System, in which all the countries concerned who had been seeking to claim parts of Antarctica
Yeah.
agreed that they would not place military bases there, and they
Yeah.
would not be able to own or exploit the parts of Antarctica that they had laid claim to.
Yeah.
So this is really where you can see a real life um, foretelling of the Prime Directive, because it is essentially the Prime Directive just
Mhm.
in a legal context, in a real world legal
Yeah.
context. It's very much the same philosophy of we don't want all those serious problems of over exploitation in the past, of colonies being set up, of areas being absolutely wrecked,
Yeah.
of natural resources being ransacked without any chance of them being renewed. So that is an exact depiction of the sort of thing that you're talking about,
Yeah.
and it is where the governments, to their credit, were able to step in and agree on something that was going to prevent that from happening. And that's very much a real world equivalent to the Prime Directive, I would
Yeah.
suggest.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that is harder to implement the wider a canvas you apply it to? So, obviously Antarctica is quite a small area, when you're implying that to the when you're applying that to the whole of space, it's
Well,
slightly
what's
more difficult.
interesting is that, of course, then around about 10 years later, roughly, almost exactly the same time that Star Trek was really starting, you then
Yeah.
had the introduction of what's called the Outer Space Treaty.
Mhm.
And the Outer Space Treaty, again, it's a treaty arranged through the offices of the United Nations. The Outer Space Treaty is very important when it comes to space law. It's
Yeah.
effectively like the Magna Carta of space law, and that really brings those sorts of principles to bear through the whole of outer space.
Yeah.
So it's like the Antarctica Treaty System. It's very much a disarmament treaty. It's trying to stop the proliferation, particularly of weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the governments of the world will agree not to put massive weapons of mass destruction, huge nuclear arms, for example,
Yeah.
in space or base them on the moon. And also, all the countries of the world will agree that they cannot claim parts of the moon or Mars or the other planets, or indeed anywhere else, really, any part of outer space itself for
Yeah.
themselves. So again, you've got that principle that's akin to the Prime Directive. It's not quite the same, because the Prime
Yeah.
Directive is really all about not interfering with pre-warp societies,
Yeah.
which is all to do with intelligent species. Whereas in the real world, the space law and the Antarctic Treaty System are more about stopping overexploitation of natural resources and preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, for example. But nevertheless, the philosophy is still very much the same. And I agree, the Outer Space Treaty has been hugely successful in stopping the spreading of weapons. But again, what we're now coming to in our present times is because there are now once again renewed aspirations to settle and move to the moon, to set up bases on the moon, to exploit the moon's natural resources, and even, according to our friend Mr. Musk, move over to Mars, for example. These things are very much coming to the fore. So your point about regulating these things on the broadest canvas possible really do come to bear. And I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I suppose at the moment we're in a situation where it's not a major problem because A, it's too expensive, and B, we've no evidence that there's any massive resources there. So I think if it came to a point where it was cheaper to travel to the stars and everybody suddenly thought, oh, look, there's a planet that's 80% oil, they might all be kind of fighting over it.
Yeah. My dad always said, because I always used to, when I was a little boy, I used to say, because I was disappointed growing up in the 70s that there weren't astronauts. I mean, there were astronauts on the moon in the 70s, but very much the earliest part of the 70s. Towards the end of the 70s, when I was getting interested in space, I was disappointed that there were no astronauts still going to the moon. And my dad would say it's because, there's nothing there. If there were mountains of gold on the moon, they'd be all over it, But I think what's interesting from that, from a scientific perspective, is that the moon actually, in many ways, is a superb resource for the exploration of the solar system. So the regolith, the lunar soil, contains chemicals and metals that are of the greatest use in the exploration of space. And there's also a lot of speculation that a lot of the surface of the moon could be covered in helium-3, which is an element that is of use if you're I don't know, but you may be into nuclear fusion. If you've got a nuclear fusion generator in your spare room, Paul, helium-3 will be something that you'll be thinking about a great deal. And it's often said that the surface of the moon may be covered in it because this is something that this is something that space is in simple terms, flies through lots of space. We don't get so much of it on Earth because we're protected by our atmosphere, but it's found on the moon because the moon does have an atmosphere, but it's extremely tenuous. So helium-3 accumulates on the lunar surface, apparently. So that might be of use if you were into your nuclear fusion. And of course, it's now discovered that there are large quantities of water on the moon as well. So it doesn't have mountains of gold, it doesn't have lakes of oil or whatever, but the moon actually in many ways is the perfect stopping off point if you wanted to then explore the rest of the solar system.
It's interesting that you've kind of mentioned that there about the water, because it shows how quickly things have changed over the last few decades. Because I remember as a kid sort of reading some of this stuff in my, Ladybird Book of Space Travel or whatever, and it kind of saying that there's no evidence that there's any water anywhere else other than on Earth, and even saying there's no concrete evidence that there are planets around any of these stars. And now we know there are billions of planets, and we know that there is water out there as well. So.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, to think about because I remember going to talks on space as a child, and the scientists saying we don't know. We all think there might be planets around the other stars, but we don't know. And now you're absolutely there's far more, I think, really, than anybody ever expected. Far, far more. I mean, to think it was only about 30 years ago that the first one was discovered, and now there are huge numbers of them. The whole, I mean, in many ways, that has changed the universe for us, really. Think about it. Now we know there definitely are, and not only there definitely are, there's loads of them. To go back to water, I think the thing about water that you have to remember is that water is quite scarce in our part of the solar system because we're so near the sun.
Yeah.
So a lot of it gets evaporated, disintegrated into its constituent parts, for example. And I have to say, I'm not a scientist, so please forgive me for not talking the exact proper scientific terms. But when you get beyond, say, the asteroid belt, when you get into the orbit of Jupiter, Saturn, and the outer planets, there's loads of ice. The ice, a lot of those moons, ice is a very important constituent part, and it's so cold, ice is effectively like rock. So a lot of those moons, ice is there's so much ice out there. I mean, in this project talking about space exploration, you come across people saying there's enough water in the form of ice to support trillions of humans in the solar system if we really wanted to. So, I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to say, because water is so important for life in general and for human life as well. Water is without doubt one of the most important elements to support life, and it's also used, as fuel as well, because you've got oxygen and hydrogen as the only components of it. So it's such a useful and important element. So the fact that there is huge quantities out there in the outer solar system is an extraordinary and I think really inspiring and exciting thought in terms of the human exploration of space.
Yeah. I suppose that for most of the universe, the ice is its default state. It's only because we are in this, particular position of being reasonably close to our sun that we've got liquid water.
Yes, absolutely. I think if you look into it scientifically, the presence of liquid water on the surface of a planet is pretty strange. We've got so much of it here. We're planet water, really. It should be called planet water rather than planet Earth. It's a remarkable thing, and it may be that is what is so unique about the Earth, and one of the key things that supports life. And it may be, to my mind, it may be the fact that one of those things that leads Earth to being the only planet, at least in our galaxy, that supports life. Although I know I'm desperately controversial for saying that.
I shall leave you as you left me, as you left her, marooned for all eternity in the center of a dead planet. Buried alive, buried alive. Sean! Sean!
In Star Trek, we're often shown the legal systems of other planets as well outside the Federation, such as the Klingon legal system and so on. How easy do you think it would be for an organization like Starfleet to align their idea of justice with somewhere else's idea of justice?
Well, that's a fascinating point. I think you have to understand the Federation's position on infinite strength and infinite diversity. So the underlying philosophy of the Federation, as opposed to Starfleet, is very open and very much in the realms of, we would think, a hyper-liberal sort of situation, a situation that you might disparagingly call one of moral relativism, in the sense that we're not here to look down upon other cultures, we're not here to denigrate or decry other systems for having their own points of view on it. I think also the Prime Directive does play a role in the sense that if a society has warp capability, then according to the Prime Directive, Starfleet and the Federation can get involved and interfere if there is manifest injustice or manifest vulnerability to citizens of the Federation, for example. So I think those principles play a role as well. But I think what I come back to is that it is a general position of non-interference. And I think in particular, you can see that in Star Trek Next Generation, in Picard's role, in the role that he plays within Klingon society. In the sense that he's not actually there to remake it, the whole thing. He's there to work it, and he's there to work the system, as it were, in the particular position that he adopts. I also think of all the times, particularly as a fan of the Next Generation, where data suddenly becomes a repository of all known legal knowledge on a particular culture, and Captain Picard, and I have to say this always makes me smile as a lawyer. Captain Picard has data analyze that jurisprudence, as we lawyers would say, of that particular society to find any loopholes or wrinkles that they can exploit. And in particular, I'm thinking of that episode where they encounter a person who is trying to represent themselves as the epitome of that society's devil. If you call that particular, and that involved data analyzing reams of jurisprudence of that particular society to find a way. And that makes me smile as a lawyer, because a lot of clients often think that that's what being a lawyer is all about, in finding wrinkles and loopholes in the law that you can exploit to win a case, when it isn't. It isn't. I mean, once in a blue moon it might be, but generally that's not how we operate. But again, it comes back to the demands of making an exciting story that interests the audience.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because they are shown as being kind of respectful to other legal systems. Because even if you think of like Star Trek 6, where they're tried by the Klingons, and although it might seem a very harsh punishment and so on by the Federation standards, they don't, they'll take legal moves to try and get them out, but they don't kind of go, oh, we're not going to accept this. They just go, all right, okay, that's their law. We have to accept that, It's down to Spock on his own going off and trying to help them,
Yeah, thinking this is my chance to at last be a captain now that Kirk's out of the way. I think in some ways that's a reminder of the concept of politics as being real. So if we're the Federation, perhaps we can't disobey Klingon rules, because that then effectively becomes an act of war. So you might think, if we're the Federation, we're just going to transport Kirk and McCoy off the surface of that planet, which I think is what they do in any event. But you think they would do that officially, as it were, as a means of recourse rather than subterfuge. But I think what in many ways that comes back to is that if we do this, if we overstep the mark, then this is effectively an act of war. And you see that in international politics, where countries start off at least by respecting another country's rules and regulations. So you think of journalists, for example, being imprisoned in Russia or Iran or other countries of that sort. And it's not as if the British or the American governments immediately swing into action and send choppers in to rescue them or whatever. But then again, and if they were to do so, that then risks a larger escalation of that incident. But there are times when they do, and I suppose what it comes back to is a judgment. So I wonder if that's in many ways reflecting it's not only reflecting the Federation's principled approach, but also just reflecting the real world diplomacy.
I mean, of course, in the world as it is today, we have the legal systems of different countries vary enormously, because you could commit a murder in the United States and get 15 life sentences. You could do the same crime in Japan and be out of prison in 7 years. How likely do you think that something like a sort of legal system that the Federation has ever happening would be?
That's a fascinating point there, because what that involves in many ways is the enforceability or otherwise of international law. So we have international law. We have the International Court of Justice that is supposed to take people to task if they've committed war crimes, for example. So this is a fascinating area of law. There is a whole body of international law, and space law is very much part of that system, because it involves laws that different countries are supposed to respond to. In many ways, when we talk about, for example, this in the context of space exploration, I always think this is one of the hardest aspects, one of the things that is really holding everything back from large-scale exploration of space, for example, because the physical problems, the technological problems, the engineering problems are still much the same as they were during the days of Project Apollo. and with sufficient money, all those things could be overcome. And if there was a pressing political need to have a base on the moon, and there was the money to be had, it could be done. There's nothing physically stopping that happening. It is simply a question of the money that countries want to put into it. But if we're talking about the large scale exploration and settlement of space, for example, that really will involve countries cooperating together in a way that is unprecedented at the moment. So moving forward to the sort of society that one sees in Star Trek, with the United Federation of Planets, with the United Earth Republic, for example, with Star Trek, because of course in the Star Trek future there's a world war, there's a third world war, and then from that there is then the world government of the United Earth Republic. And in many ways, Paul, to be frank with you, we are even further behind that becoming a reality than we were perhaps when the original series of Star Trek started. Because in many ways, whilst for example, the United Nations and other international bodies do wonderful work, for example, in terms of human health and disaster relief and so forth, in terms of simply cooperation to avoid wars, for example, as we've seen with so many wars around the country, around the globe at the moment, we're perhaps the times that we live in many ways are even more fragmented than in some ways than they were during the Cold War. Because at least during the Cold War, the countries had an interest, if they had to, of working together, which is where, for example, the Outer Space Treaty comes into effect. That was something that the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, recognized they needed to have, and it was in their interest to avoid a much more serious problem of the massive proliferation of nuclear weapons. Whereas now, for historical reasons, the United States and Russia, for example, don't have that kind of element of common interest, I don't think, in the way that they relate to one another. I mean, I'm not saying for one instant the United States and Soviet Union weren't deadly enemies; they really were. But there was I think there was an understanding that sometimes they did actually have to come up with something to work together. Whereas I think that is gone. So this mode of this concept of moving together and more cooperation is to me, that is far more than the scientific and engineering aspects of the society that we see in Star Trek. That is far more of a stumbling block and what is holding us back. And that comes out in many ways when we're talking about space law in such principles as what's called the common heritage principle. The common heritage principle in space law is a development of these ideas of not exploiting or owning areas of outer space, and ensuring that if there is some use of it, that it is used for the benefit of all of humanity. And this is one of the principles that is underlying what's called the Moon Agreement. The Moon Agreement was in many ways a follow-on from the Outer Space Treaty. The Moon Agreement was in the late 70s, and that arose at the United Nations because of concerns that if the United States or the Soviet Union, as it was then, set up bases, for example, on the moon, that they would exploit it for their own benefit. And the poorer, undeveloped parts of the world, particularly, would be left behind and so would effectively suffer. Whilst the rich, developed world made use of these resources, they would be left behind. So the Moon Agreement was very much with that in mind. And that is where this philosophy of the common heritage principle comes into effect in space law. And that sort of principle is a development of this kind of quasi-prime directive approach, where you are looking to the long term and you are thinking ahead and trying to avoid problems that you've had in the past resurfacing and rebubbling again. And you are trying to have mechanisms in place so that not only are these problems avoided, but there is a benefit to all of us. So it's very far-sighted. It's very far-sighted, the common heritage principle. It's attacked a great deal as something that is holding back the exploitation of outer space. But I don't think that's really fair, because it doesn't stop natural resources in outer space being used, but it does mean that they ought to be used wisely. and not just for the benefit of the super rich, for the Mr. Musks of this world.
Yeah. Well,
so, sorry, Paul, do carry on.
no, I was just going to say, I think this is the least credible aspect of sort of Star Trek's vision of the future, really, is this idea of there being no money. That, you know, nobody is rich, nobody is poor. It's an almost communist.
Sure.
They probably would have balked at the idea of being communist in the 60s, but that's almost what it is. You know, there's no money. And I think it's although that might seem a desirable thing, I think it's hard to imagine because I mean, the West particularly is incredibly money driven now. The United States is more money driven than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that in many ways this whole concept of reaching towards that future society that is depicted in Star Trek, that is suggested by the philosophy that underlines the common heritage principle, seems fantastic to us. It seems, in many ways, is perhaps the most futuristic element. Never mind warp drive, never mind, because those are engineering things. That's just a tricky problem to solve. These things really go to the heart of what it is to be human in a modern society. And that's why perhaps it becomes difficult to envisage. But what I think about that is that, and this is not my idea, this is something that I read the other day. Think about, there are two really important things that we have that in many ways are effectively like this futuristic society already. Two of the most important things to support being alive that we have. The first is water.
Yeah.
So when you think about water, the fact that we have drinkable water in effectively sort of unlimited quantities, particularly if you're just thinking in terms of cooking and drinking using water. If you think of drinking, if you think I'm thirsty, I want a drink of water. If you live in England, if you live in the UK, at any time you can have a drink of perfectly healthy, pure water from a tap. Okay, so think about, and that's only been for, I don't know, 100 years or so, let's say, for example. You think how difficult life would have been before that. If you think about how thirsty you can feel. I mean, I don't feel thirsty anymore, but as a little boy racing around, for example, outdoors, I'd get thirsty once in a while and I'd need a glass of water or whatever. But you think how enormously beneficial having clean water, and then you think about how useful it is for cooking, for example, or washing, for example. Now, of course, we do pay for water, and you know, water bills go up and up and all this sort of thing. But when you think about what you're getting for it, it's not free. There's no way that it's not free. But it's such an enormous benefit that we have that we take totally for granted. And if you took it away, life would be impossible. You think about when there's a drought, or when there's a water stoppage or whatever, and how difficult life becomes. And you know, people can't wash, they start stinking, can't cook anymore, etc., etc. So Star Trek effectively depicts what's called a post-scarcity society. So things are no longer scarce in the Star Trek universe, because you can have a meal for free whenever you want. Effectively, you can clothe yourself in perfectly fine clothes, all those sort. You don't have to work to have a house, for example. So it's just, but we live. You can see it in terms of we already live in a post-scarcity society, at least at the moment, because who knows what's around the corner in England when it comes to water. Okay, which is, when you think about it, water is so important. It's like half of what makes life livable in many ways. If that was taken away and we had to live like they did 500 years ago when it comes to water, people nowadays would probably find it intolerable. At least for the first 6 months or so, it would really be very difficult to live. Okay, the next thing to mention is our wonderful NHS. Now, the NHS, of course, the NHS is perhaps to me, the NHS is the thing that puts the great in Great Britain. And the NHS is a extraordinary, fantastic idea. And it has its problems. Many of us know greatly that the NHS has, and more it has its problems. But the fundamental idea, and the way, at least some of the time in general, it's executed is amazing. it is fantastic what you are getting, the benefit that you are getting for that. Again, it's like we are living in a post-scarcity society when we have the NHS, sort of. In a you know, okay, we pay a lot for it with our taxes. But you think about when you really need the NHS, what you get from it compared to what you pay for it over the years.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, it is almost as if we have a Star Trek style society, and we take the NHS, we take water totally for granted. So maybe it's not actually that completely bizarre and completely mad. And the thing about the NHS is that people raised exactly the arguments that you said, that people should pay for it. People have got to pay for it. It's outrageous that we should. It's a communistic idea that we should have a national health service that is paid for in this way. All those arguments were made before the NHS came in. But as Tony Benn likes to say, not even Mrs. Thatcher would try and actually end the NHS. Yeah. She might reform it greatly so it becomes totally different from what it is. She would never actually completely eradicate it because it's become so ingrained and so powerful and important. And again, water. We can talk about the relative merits of nationalized versus privatized water and all those sorts of things. Yeah. But the ultimate thing is, what I come back to is, water is so essential to human life and keeping us comfortable, particularly. To take that away would, we are like a post-scarcity society when it comes to water. So although I agree, these things seem massively impossible, who knows? 300 years from now, when Star Trek is set, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great to live like that? Yeah. So perhaps with key things like water, like the NHS, we can start to see where the building blocks for that sort of society might come from. Yeah. And going back to the common heritage principle, for example, to fully implement this idea of the resources and it's not just outer space, it's also the common heritage principle is also supposed to be applied to, for example, the exploitation of the seabed. Yeah. So when you hear about companies, when you hear about Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk wanting to settle Mars or move to the moon, for example, and exploit the natural resources there, or people also talk about asteroid mining and utilizing the minerals on asteroids, for example. There's also there's no reason why, in principle, that argument can't be applied to the seabed, because there's lots of materials, lots of minerals on the seabed, and these particular minerals can be of great need in a society such as ours that is based on ultra advanced technology. Some of these minerals are very important to keep all our tech going, as it were. Yeah. So the seabed is under a similar sort of regime to the one that applies to outer space. And you're thinking about the common heritage principle for the seabed as well. But the fullest implementation of that principle could involve what's sometimes called a common heritage assembly, which is like the United Nations General Assembly, and you get representatives from lots of different countries present, and they work together without reference to which country they're from. Yeah. So if you can imagine, they're all in a big hall deciding things, or online, whatever, deciding things. But when they take their decisions, they do so in a way that has no reference to which country they're from. Yeah. And again, this might seem fantastic or extraordinary to us at the moment, that diplomats, for example, could ever operate in that way. Because, of course, when diplomats are on the international scene, all they are thinking about really is what is in my country's best interests. Yeah. Particularly in, if Trump, heaven forbid, comes back into the White House, you've got somebody who very much is the embodiment of that sort of principle. But so this is another example of thinking ahead. What might the future? How might we get to the future society that's depicted in Star Trek? And in many ways, this is far harder than any of the kind of technical engineering problems that we think of.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, myself included, thought after COVID, after lockdown and all that, things would change. People would start being more reasonable with each other, but it just doesn't seem to have happened. If anything, it's gone the opposite way.
Which is unfortunate. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think the pandemic has had a very profound effect on society that we might not actually recognize for years to come.
Yeah.
In many ways. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But this is really thinking through how would we get to the type of society that is depicted in Star Trek. And cultural changes can happen. I mean, our culture is a lot different from the culture 200 or 300 years ago, for example. I mean, the United Kingdom doesn't go out and conquer other countries nowadays and enslave their populations, for example. Not, we can't, for one reason, we don't have the military strength to do so. It would just be inconceivable that we would as a country do that, even if we could. So things do change.
Just very slowly.
Yes, absolutely. And the fear is that even if there was something that was going to happen, even if there was going to be some sort of change towards that end, there might be some terrible war or some horrible accident that would stop us from reaching that point, for example. There's a very famous book called Dark Skies, which is quite a recent book, which tries to study what are the implications of a society such as the one depicted in Star Trek. So if you think of a real world equivalent of the society in Star Trek, you might think, for example, of there being settlements on the moon, settlements on Mars, perhaps settlements on some of the moons of Jupiter, on some of the asteroids. There might be large space habitats in orbit around the Earth, for example, with hundreds or even perhaps thousands of people on it. That's kind of a kind of real world equivalent to what this kind of future that you wouldn't have transporters necessarily. I don't think they're ever going to, as far as we know, they're ever going to be possible. You wouldn't have faster than light space travel, but that would be the kind of nearest real world equivalent that we could think. And what the book Dark Skies really does is to explore what are the implications of that, particularly given the very fractious international relations that we have at the moment. And in many ways, it's not an optimistic picture. So, for example, if there were large space habitats up in orbit, for example, those things, firstly, I mean, they might be equipped with weapons of mass destruction. They might have missiles based on them, for example. There might be military installations in orbit if there were countries that were powerful enough to build those. And so the population on Earth would actually be under a serious threat of destruction if those things were in orbit. And one of the things that is implicit in those sorts of plans, for example, building large space habitats or building installations on other planets, is the use of what are called mass drivers. Now, mass drivers are things where if you've heard of the hover train, for example, in Japan that moves on electromagnetics. If you imagine one of those moving really swiftly with a big cage in it that can catapult materials up into space. So if you're building a big space settlement in Earth orbit, one of the easiest ways to do that is to use what's called a mass driver on the moon, because of course the moon's got a lot less gravity, to fling material from the moon, so big chunks of moon rock basically from the moon into Earth orbit, and use those to build your space settlement. And that actually is a lot easier than having to move all the material up from the Earth's surface, because the gravity is so much less. And that is likely to be, if there's going to be the great big space habitats, for example, that you see in Star Trek, you know the space base that they have at the Enterprise goes. If you think of a space settlement that kind of size, mass drivers are one of the easiest ways to build something with that much material in it. But the problem is that those things can very easily be used as weapons. So instead of just driving the material into Earth orbit, you can use it as a weapon, effectively, like a rain of asteroids striking the Earth. So a sufficiently advanced nation, or indeed private company, such as SpaceX, if it had that facility, it would then potentially be a serious threat to the population back here on Earth. So when you're thinking about that kind of Star Trek style, real world Star Trek style setup, that actually might lead to a reign of terror. It might be a dictatorship. Far from the futuristic society that you see in Star Trek, benign and peaceable and very open and liberal. It might actually be a dictatorship and a terrifying world to live in, with that with one nation or more than one nation or one company having that much power. It could actually be utterly terrifying. So that's the problem with space settlement at the moment. But the conclusion of that story is the conclusion of that book rather is that if it's going to happen, society has to move towards having the values that you see in Star Trek. Of all the nations working together, not necessarily a world government, but a peaceful world where the nations of the world come together for the common good. And space law already provides the principles to do that. So in many ways, the conclusion of my studies is that the real world equivalent of the Prime Directive, all those things that seem most exciting about the Star Trek style society, we actually already have in space law. It's just a question of putting them into action.
Well, I think that's a good place to end this. So I'll say, Adam, thank you for joining me on the October Club.
You are very welcome. It's a delight to be here, Paul. I'm sorry if I've rambled incoherently for far too long.
That's absolutely fine. It
fascinates me.
That's right.
Great to speak to you.
That was Star Trek Lore with Adam Manning. And that was the last in the current series of the October Club. Fingers crossed we'll be opening our doors again this coming October with a whole new series of interesting guests and exciting chats. You've been listening to the October Club. That was Star Trek Lore, presented by Paul Ferry, with special guest star Adam Manning. The theme music was written by Peter Falconer. The series was produced and edited by Paul Ferry.